I'm Olaf Gradin, Cloud Architect for VMware.
And I'm Jason Ford, a Senior Consultant at Improving.
The Terraform Provider AzureRM has produced a major release, which doesn't happen often, so I think it's pretty exciting, and we should probably talk a little bit about that. AzureRM 3.0 has been released, and in fact, as I say this, they are now on 3.1, so that's a fairly significant movement in a short period of time to get to a .1 release, a minor, I guess is what we would call that, 3.1. 3.1, so we'll talk about what's interesting in 3.0, but 3.1, I would recommend anybody who's looking at using the 3.0 probably go ahead and move directly to 3.1, or perhaps even later. You may want to look at the release statement. As of today, 3.0, 3.01, 3.02, 3.1 all came out in fairly quick succession. They mostly addressed a number of different bug fixes, but there were a couple of enhancements added to that as well. So nothing critical, I would say, unless some of those resources that were fixed are things that you work on directly, in which case, of course, you'll need to get the updates. But I didn't see any major like security, critical security vulnerabilities or anything like that that would say immediately go to this version, Regardless of that, I would recommend going to 3.1 or greater, depending on your needs. So 3.0, some of the interesting things that I found in 3.0, and I'll point out a couple of things. We've got Terraform provided some pretty good documentation around this. We talked about this in another video, but the AzureRM provider is actually HashiCorp is responsible for it, and they maintain it in a partnership with Microsoft. So between the two companies, they provided some good documentation on along the way. We knew that things were in sort of the deprecation statement, or we knew that there were features pending for this 3.0 release. And now that we are here, the information that came out is pretty solid. We've got the release statement that talks about what's new, but we've also got a guide that talks about a 3.0 upgrade guide. And so that's very welcome. It's not as slick as a Terraform upgrade guide. If any of you have gone through a Terraform upgrade, you know that you've probably seen this, Jason. They give you like that flag where you can throw in I forget what it's called, but it's a upgrade preparation check. And it'll go through your code and let you know, hey, you've got some areas that you probably are going to need to fix. And in some cases, it would fix them automatically for you. So I'm still waiting to see that in a provider. That would be pretty slick, but I'm sure that that's like Terraform binary integration to do that. Nonetheless,
sorry.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
So I felt like when Terraform upgrades, it upgrades the state, but the provider, AzureRM provider, is upgrading actual resources and resource types. So it might be trickier to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's a gross oversimplification to say it would be nice if they did this, but it still would be nice.
Yeah, I agree.
Somebody brilliant can probably figure this out, I'm hoping. And nonetheless, the upgrade guide that they provided is solid. It does provide a lot of guidance on the resources that need to move, the properties that changed, the I don't know. There's just a bunch of different items that they point out in the upgrade guide that you need to go back and check. So it's fairly easy for you to look and doing a direct comparison to figure out what resources changed versus what resources you have might be a little tedious. But I might guess with some scripting, you could do like a cross-reference where you identify all the terms in the upgrade guide and cross-reference that with your code output to show all the resources that you're using. That sounds like an interesting little script that I may take up that challenge just to try it out. It sounds like an interesting script to work out. So we'll move on, though, to what I found interesting within the major upgrade. The provider itself has a some new feature flags. So there's a resource group block, as you are familiar, and the flag that got thrown into that is actually the prevent deletion if contains resources. If contain, yeah. And this is kind of an interesting flag because in the past, if you attempted to delete a resource group in which other resources existed, then it would just do it, right? Like a good example of this is if you build a platform that then builds out other things. So for instance, if I built out a Kubernetes platform and then later Kubernetes auto scales and builds out more nodes within that resource group, Terraform doesn't know or care anything about those. So when I make changes to that, if either I'm recreating the resource group or I'm doing a destroy action on it, it's going to destroy everything in the resource group, whether Terraform owns it or not, because the things that exist in the resource group outside of its control, it doesn't know about, right? So it'll just delete everything. So with this new flag, though, you can actually, it's effectively like a lock. And so I've used locks extensively for this exact purpose. If I have a resource group that I need to be sure I don't delete on accident, then I will put a management lock on it. But now the resource group block has a flag, prevent deletion if contains resources. And so now you can effectively lock it and do just that, prevent the deletion of that resource group if there are resources outside of or even inside of the management of Terraform. So I think that's pretty cool and could be useful. I would recommend people try this out for areas in your code that are what I would call nuclear within your configuration. So if you imagine like where your state lives, this is a big one that I always hit. My state lives in a resource group on a remote backend within Azure in a storage account. Well, that resource group and that storage account are pretty important to everything. And so I put management locks on those things so that they don't accidentally get deleted by somebody in the portal or by some errant code that I write in Terraform. Okay, so something else we have here. Oh yeah, this is a good one. Upgrading to the latest Terraform binary is, I think it's 1.0 at this point. So actually, it doesn't require 1.0 yet, but if you are not on 1.0, the 1.0 series of Terraform, it will require it as of version 4 of the AzureRM provider. So the AzureRM provider is moving up, and as it does, it's also sort of lifting up the minimum required version of Terraform. I should have checked this out. I think the minimum on Terraform might be v.12 for AzureRM provider. But we're approaching the era where it's going to require the 1.0 release. And for those of you who've been involved with this in the past, the move, we talked about this a little bit in the past, but the move from probably from 12 up to 1.0 was really fast. It was just version after minor release after minor release as we went through 12, 13, 14, 15. You may not have even moved into some of those versions. You might have just skipped ahead and moved from like 12 to 15 or 12 to 1 or something like that. That was my case. Jason, did you work through each of those versions?
No, it was impossible. I think they're doing like weekly releases. So
it was
by the
crazy.
time by the time you figured out all the issues you were having moving to like 13, then it's like you're at 15 now, so you're trying to move up, and then we hit 1, and that was a drastic shift too. So yeah, there was no way to keep up with that.
Yeah, and that was my experience too. I just moved right up into 1.0 eventually because it was kind of the most interesting, attractive one to move into. I think I played around in 14 for a little while, but for the bulk of your code, a lot of times you kind of get stuck pinned. But the thing to take from this is that moving forward, there's going to be a minimum required for 1.0. So I would work hard at this point, if you're not at the 1.0 series, to make sure that you're you're getting up to par on 1.0 so that you'll be ready for V4 when it comes out. When each of these comes out, they always bring about lots of new resources. I didn't record the actual number, but there are hundreds of resources that are available to us within the provider. I want to say that they're in the neighborhood of 700. I feel like that's what I had read at one point. Different types of resources that they support within Azure. And so each of these major releases brings about more of those. And, in some cases, those are probably things that maybe they just didn't have support for a long time. But in other cases, it's all the new stuff that Azure is adding as well. And so they just iteratively add those things throughout the course of the release.
Well, one of the biggest changes I saw when I was looking is the app services changed.
Yeah.
So before you had one resource for app service, and you said this is a Windows one, this is a Linux one, but now they have specific app services for Windows and for Linux.
Yeah, and I feel like app services is where a great majority of the changes actually happened. Refactoring some of the feature flags, the properties, arguments, what have you. That is where a lot of the changes occurred. And I haven't actually built one out with 3.0 to see what it looks like yet, but I'm guessing that you could have a more sort of distributed app service, whereas in the past it was maybe just like one massive block with lots of properties to it. Now you could actually break it out into different units and pieces. What I don't know is if you get stuck with that interesting relationship where you have like these sub resources or virtual resources. So you create your app service, and then as you create other ones, do they require a state linkage with the app service, or do they act independently? And I don't know yet. So that's to be determined. And of course, if you know, certainly provide feedback in the comments. We'll be happy to read those and share that as we are able to.
Well, when I found that out, I was excited but disappointed because most of my Terraform was in the old app service. So I was trying to figure out like the effort of moving my resources into the new version. It's put on hold for now.
Yeah, I was gonna say, have you done it yet?
No, because like the projects aren't really ready for that. But at least you can pin the old version so that you don't have to move up if you don't want to. I also felt like when you're tinkering around with the app services, I think it'll be nice because sometimes when you're using the old old resource blocks, you end up it's very specific. Like if you're running the Linux version, you have to have different parameters, and it's just it was kind of just one big mess. And so if they're breaking out, maybe it'll explain it better instead of like, oh, this is the Linux one, so you'd need to have Linux are this in the app config. So I'm hoping to at least clarify it because it was hard.
We saw that, and I'm guessing that they have deprecated the app service resource block. I'm not certain if they have, but I'm guessing that they deprecated it, which means that you can still use it, but that it'll just be marked as a warning within your validation. But this is very much like the Azure Virtual Machine resource. And I think there's still a lot of people that use Azure Virtual Machine instead of Azure Linux Virtual Machine or Azure Windows Virtual Machine. So they broke it out exactly the same. And the value is the same thing that you're talking about, that there were a lot of Linux specific properties and modifications that apply to Linux machines, but not to Windows machines. And you have a conglomeration of both within this one resource. So you've got two different types of people perhaps reading through that documentation and having to weed through the bits that don't apply to them in that case. So it is nice to get like a context resource, a contextual resource. To that point though, the moving, I did look into that a little bit, moving the resources over. Unfortunately, well, so there's two possibilities here. One is unfortunate. One is that you may have to do what you've always had to do, they changed the name of the resources as you indicated, from app service to like Linux app service or Windows app service. And to move a resource from one to the other, you would typically delete the state entry for the app service, and then you would import the state entry for its appropriate Linux or Windows-based app service. And you would do that after you've already written the code, of course, or refactored your code to include the Linux app service resource or the Windows app service resource. Now, there's also, as of Terraform probably 1.0. I don't actually know exactly when this came out, but there was the inclusion of a provider block called moved, which has two, it expects two properties, from and to. That's it. And so the moved block allows you to specify an old Terraform resource ID and a new Terraform resource ID. And it simply is a pointer to the state to indicate that it needs to move the state pointers to reflect a new location for these resources. Nothing else has really changed about them. So that may actually work here and would be probably a good use if it works the way I think it should. It would be good use because using the moved block allows you to document the code transformation over time. So if you're moving to the 3.0 provider and you now need to break up your resource, well, it's a fair amount of work, kind of like you're alluding to, Jason. You've got clients who can't move because they just don't have time to put toward that type of change. If you can use a moved block, then you can at least make iterative notes in code that actually have effect on state, so multiple maintainers can see sort of the process or the progress of moving the entirety of an app service over to something else. Or maybe it's blocks and pieces that you're moving, or maybe it's just the whole app service itself. But you can at least see sort of the process of how many app services have been done, how many still remain, and that lives on. It can live on indefinitely in the code because it's a fairly benign entry after the change has already been made. Okay, this is probably another good time too to point out. You mentioned pinning, so really important to use pinning. I'm sure a lot of people got the 3.0 update unexpectedly, and that would be a rough one to get unexpectedly, as you were pointing out. If you were depending on app services and you got the 3.0 update, suddenly you're getting all these warnings about using Linux and Windows-based app services. So pinning is a good strategy, and at this point in time, maybe your pinning just says anything less than 3.0, and then you will stay up at that 2.99 release before you're ready to move on to the 3.0. So that can be really important. And then, moving forward, maybe you're going to say anything up to 3.1, or anything greater than 3, depending on how you roll with that. So important note, make sure you're using pinning. Some of the other changes in AzureRM 3.0, they are now defaulting to TLS 1.2. I think this is a great change because there's been warnings going on for quite a while that will indicate that you need that support for TLS 1.0 and 1.1 is going away within the resources. And if you haven't specifically gone in and added TLS 1.2 minimum to all of the resources that support that, now that is the default. So you don't have to go and seek them out and move them. As you apply those, they should go back and make them 1.2 compliant.
That'd be nice.
Yeah, that's helpful, right? Rather than hunting them all down to change
find
them.
the right resource and right attribute.
Finding the right attribute. That's the thing.
So that the security team doesn't get mad at you again.
Yeah. Well, and it also gives you a good reason why you need to go and apply your Terraform configs that otherwise are unchanged. Just a quick aside, I would say that applying Terraform routinely is a great idea. In fact, it is the idea. You should apply Terraform config applies frequently so that you can catch configuration drift and deal with it quickly rather than waiting 6 months or a year and suddenly realizing you've got a week worth of refactoring the code to take in all of the changes that somebody's put into other sources through the portal, through the CLI, through whatever. So run Terraform apply often, refactor often, I guess, to support those changes if that's happening, if you have drift going on in your environment, and continue to work on your culture to ensure that all changes are happening through Terraform only instead of through lots of different places. But as you do so, you're able to pick up some of these change opportunities, we'll call it. So as you bring in the 3.0 provider, it will now allow you to apply TLS 1.2 to everything. And this gives you probably a pretty solid reasoning for a change control team to give you to apply this update. It's not just applying updates, we're actually applying a security fix here.
I'm thinking that a possibility of moving your code into a newer version, if you were to go to 3.0 for Azure, is using the provider alias and calling new resources and potentially doing like a cutover. I've not tried it yet, but
No, that would work.
possible.
I have tried running. Did I do that? I believe I think no. I think I only conceptually planned it out. So I've certainly used multiple versions of the provider, and conceptually, I thought that it made sense that you could run two versions of the provider. My assumption, and somebody can say whether or not this is true, my assumption was that by creating an alias per provider, it's actually going to download the executable into a separate folder. Because all of this stuff lives under the .terraform directory inside of your system, and the binaries for the providers get downloaded and dropped into that folder for use when you actually run the Terraform apply or validate. So yeah, there is kind of a big assumption there, but that would be an interesting point to prove out as well. We'll put a pin in that and maybe come back to that at a later time if we don't get answers from somebody who's had experience with it directly.
Or just run an apply.
Yeah.
YOLO it. Just go.
That's right.
Now, only in lowers. Don't do it in prod right away. Just only in lowers.
The fear of YOLO, I think, is what has a lot of people probably still running at .11 because they have not been able to actually push their environment up to these newer versions. And the longer that goes, the more appropriate YOLO becomes, because at some point refactoring the code is just so challenging. You're almost going to have to just upgrade and deal with the issues. Yeah, start over effectively. I have been there. I understand this problem. Another, and this is probably one of the biggest changes that I noticed that was really interesting to me. I mean, obviously the resource changes, I kind of expected that, but the one that was interesting to me was the shift in identity platform. So now AzureRM is going to be using MSAL as the identity platform versus ADAL. And as I say those words, I don't remember what those acronyms stand for. I just know that MSAL is the newest graph API, and then ADAL is the Azure Active Directory API. There may be something more semantic about that, but that's effectively the way I think about it. So MSAL is graph and ADAL is AAD API. And we all know that, like, for years now, it feels that the AAD API is effectively legacy, if not deprecated. But there's still so many apps that require it. And for that matter, the AZCLI even required it for the longest time. So now it's moving to MSAL, which is great. We get to make use of the latest identity platform that Microsoft provides. And the biggest material difference that we get there is that you can now use Microsoft personal accounts in addition to school or work or enterprise type accounts. And I don't know that a lot of people have a strict requirement for that, but being on the latest platform obviously is a better place to be for when it comes to identity, when it comes in regards to security. And I know that obviously there are a lot of improvements to the security of that platform, but there's also some efficiencies gained They've they've narrowed some of the calls that need to be made, so it's just a more efficient platform in general. I was surprised though to see that there was less of a material difference to me as an end user. The one notable exception though is that in order to actually make use of MSAL, you have to actually specify it in various contexts. So where the binary itself, I guess, uses MSAL immediately, if you're specifying a remote backend for Azure, then you actually have to tell it with a feature flag in your backend configuration to say use Microsoft Graph equals true. Doing that, it will then use MSAL. Prior to that, it's going to continue to use ADAL until, what is it, Terraform 1.2. So I think we are on, well, the one that I run right now is 1.17, I believe. So at 1.2, it will default to using MSAL across the board for the AzureRM provider. So again, no material difference, but improvements to the identity platform, certainly useful. Import operations. So if you do a lot of import operations, then you hate them. Well, now you're going to get another prompt on those, but actually I think it's probably a good prompt. Import operations now get a confirmation prompt. So they will, when you go to import something, it'll confirm, is this the resource that you intended to import? And what's nice about that is that it does better at matching resource type for resource type. And it also, it presents you more clear information so that you know, for instance, if you're importing a virtual machine, that you're getting the virtual machine, not like a virtual machine extension, for instance. Because you could paste in either of those resource types, and I believe it would accept it because they are both effectively virtual machine resources. But the context is a little bit different, and so when you import it, you need to know which one you actually grabbed. If you just, if you just went to, this is something that I'm guilty of. I just may go to the portal, go to the JSON view of a resource, and then just copy out the snippet that I need, and then import that. And if you grab the wrong one, then bad things happen.
Yeah,
so now
you wouldn't know until you ran your Terraform, right? After you did the import.
Right, because it would say, hey, successfully applied, no problem. And then you go to run it, and it would propose all of these changes, and you're like, wait, that should have been less changes. So
and it wants to destroy it and rebuild it.
Right. Yeah, things get dangerous at that point. Some other things, the firewall resource uses, this is an interesting little semantic change. So the firewall resource uses lists instead of sets, which in a material way means that order now matters, and a lot of times order in firewalls is actually important. If you are, and I don't know explicitly which arguments accept lists. I think that anything that used to accept a list was actually looking at sets, so order didn't matter. But if you wanted to pass a bunch of rules in as a list, then they would be ordered appropriately, and so obviously that you do need them ordered appropriately. So
you missed the look of relief on my face when you said that.
Yeah.
When the challenge is, you don't want to make unnecessary changes to firewalls, right? So if the order doesn't matter and you're trying to say it's a set and you're passing it in, I think what happens is it starts trying to, like, every time you do an apply, it says, oh, well, this is different. And so it tries to change the rules every time.
I've seen that exact thing. Yeah.
Or you want a specific rule list in IP. I've had so many issues with that. It was just like, why isn't this a list? And I've had that problem. So that's so good.
You will oftentimes see, I guess they're immaterial changes, because it'll post up like all of these changes for rules, but they actually don't make any difference. So it'll, I can't remember if it shifts the number order of them. Like you'll specify a number for the rule item, and then you run apply, and it proposes like the old ones were the wrong numbers and the new ones are the right numbers. And in the end, it doesn't do anything, right? Like it remains in the same order that it was, but it does kind of churn with those extra words that you have to look through and figure out, okay, is this something that I need to consider? So yes, being able to do a list, I think will fix that. I'm actually looking forward to that myself. There is also something that you probably need to be aware of is that within storage accounts, the allow blob public access is now referred to as, and this is just to clarify terminology better, but allow blob public access is now known as allow nested items to be public. So it's it got a bit more explicit, but I know what they're getting at, because the trouble with this particular field was there are two settings that apply to public storage accounts. One of them is whether or not you can mark something as public, and then the other one is does it have the rights to be public. So I know that there was confusion over which field was which, and when did the ACL apply versus when did the property apply. So now that it's referred to as allow nested items to be public, then this is clearly just enabling a feature set effectively. And the fact that it says nested items, I think, is important too, just to differentiate. All previously marked deprecated, I think all previously marked deprecated notices are now in effect. So for quite some time now, ever since we hit AzureRM 2.0, and perhaps even before that, we were seeing notices about certain resources that we use, certain property flags. I know a big one that I always ran into was in an Azure subnet or an Azure VNet. If you use address prefix singular instead of address prefixes, then you got a warning about that every single time. So now all of those deprecation notices are in effect. And so if you've been riding the tail on that and just ignoring those deprecation notices all this time, it's not going to work. Now those need to be fixed because they are officially deprecated. So you'll probably need to look through, and I'm sure running validate is going to be very explicit and tell you, but if you want to be ahead of the curve, then you'll want to look through the change releases and just make sure that you've covered all those deprecation notices. So maybe run a validate on your old code and make sure that and show everything, right? And make sure that you are that you've taken care of all of those deprecation notices inside the AzureRM provider at least.
I think
And that's a long list.
I think PyCharm actually marks through the deprecated attributes. I've seen that for, it's like especially with address prefix, it was marked through, even though it's valid. It at least warns you that it's.
I'd have to check and see if the HashiCorp Terraform extension in VS Code does that. In general, I've cleaned all those up over the long haul. I mean, it's been a long time. So I don't know that I have a lot of that in there now, but I could go back in and just add some invalid prefixes and see what it does. It also has, like, the way that the HashiCorp Terraform extension works in VS Code is it uses a Terraform server executable, I think they call it. And so it depends on what version that is as well, and whether or not it recognizes those, whether it's deprecated or at this point gone, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So that might be important. In some case, for the deprecation stuff, in some cases it's not just like a in some cases it's a resources deprecated. In some cases it's maybe a default, and these are probably harder to recognize. You may have been using a default all this time that is now changed, and it's a deprecated feature, but I don't know that you would have ever gotten a warning about it. So if I was using the default, for instance, for just off the top of my head, one that I remembered was that in a MS SQL database, the default basic size is like 5 gig, I think it is. And if you don't specify it, then it will be a 5 gig database. And so a lot of people probably just, especially in development, just make a 5 gig database without specifying it, right? It's just default. But that has been deprecated completely, and so now you have to specify a size. If you want a 5 gig database, you have to specify that it's a 5 gig database. So that's one where you may get bitten on a lot of things where you were assuming defaults, and those have now changed, and you have to be explicit about them. And again, I don't know a great way to figure this out other than looking through the release notes, because there isn't, I mean, there's an upgrade guide which points that out, right? But there isn't anything in code that would make that obvious, I don't think, unless of course your linter does it for you. That would be kind of cool if it warns you and says, hey, you're missing a default here. You need to specify it. Are you assuming?
Yeah, I don't imagine until you try to do your first plan and it says it can't find this value too.
Yeah.
Or you apply and it really does error out.
Yeah, because sometimes there are some things are computed and you don't find out until they are applied that you missed the mark on that. I remember reading something. I forget which one it was, but there were even some things that had moved from being computed to non-computed. So I think that only improves the experience, but that would indicate that the validator can catch those types of errors, whereas they could not in the past because they were computed and they had to wait. There's also implications. In my last week, I've been dealing a lot with for each loops, conditional expressions, which I feel like I'm always dealing with. But the bane that I was working through was whether or not something is known to for each at the time of apply. And for each will fail. I'm sure many of you know, if you're attempting to apply a for each to a resource, any kind of conditional looping like that, it has to know about the key value of that statement, or it cannot move. And it's very frustrating at times. I mean, we can get into that at some point later, but nonetheless, I am happy that some things are moving out of the compute block and back into validation step. So yeah, better user experience. And that's really good coverage of the 3.0 major release that I've encountered. There are tons of individual resources, especially as you said in app service, that have been updated that I just haven't had the pleasure to work with in the last week or so. So happy to hear about others' experience, what has changed that is intriguing to you, what's good, what's bad, let's hear it all.